Good afternoon and welcome to Restart, the webinar and podcast from Arabian Business and the Prestige Group. So, if you look at Hollywood, it's sending killer robots from the future to enslave us all. If you look at Netflix and a number of documentaries, it's powering AI, it's powering social media, which in turn is damaging our democracies, endangering our children, and generally turning us all into mindless zombies. And if you look at it economically, it's either a massive threat or a massive opportunity. I'm talking about artificial intelligence, AI. And I'm delighted today to be joined by three people with much bigger brains than mine to unpack what this all means for us. My guests are Tannya Jajal, who is a technologist, evangelist, an AI expert and a futurist, and she's also the author of an upcoming book, Thinking Machines and the Intelligence Explosion. Andrew Collinge is an advisor with Smart Dubai, and here in Dubai, he is responsible, among other things, for the Ethical AI Toolkit and Advisory Board. And finally, Mariam Al-Maheri is project manager at the Dubai Future Foundation, the DFF, which is the key player and entity responsible for imagining and inspiring Dubai's future. Welcome to you all. So, you all sound far more fascinating to me than I. So can I ask you each to give me a little bit of a download of who you are and what you do and what your passion is? And Mariam, I'll start with you if I may.
Sure. Thank you, Scott, and thanks for having me. So I lead the Center for the Fourth Industrial Revolution here at the Dubai Future Foundation, which is a collaboration between DFF and the World Economic Forum. And we focus on developing policy for emerging technology. And in this case, AI is one of the portfolios. So the other two are blockchain and precision medicine. And I guess you wanted to know something interesting or why I'm excited by this job. Well, kind of pre this, I used to do foreign policy. So this was something very different for me. And it's all very, I think, relevant to the way that we think about ourselves and our own consciousness and who we are as humans, I guess, post to super intelligence that might be the next AI.
I feel my mind expanding already, Mariam. Andrew, your turn.
Scott, hello, and hello everybody. Thank you for inviting me on today. Yeah, you said it in the introduction. For 3 years, I've been here in Smart Dubai, where I advise across all aspects of the business with regards to data, really. As you said, one of the key pieces of the work that I am involved in is our work on ethical, safe and fair AI and trying to equip the ecosystem with tools that help them achieve that. You mentioned an AI ethics board. That's a really important mechanism for us to understand how, from a range of angles, we try to make AI work. Prior to my time in Dubai, I worked for 2 mayors of London, running the data analytics team for London government and setting up their smart cities team. And why am I interested in this area? Because ostensibly, for all the talk about technology, this is about helping people and understanding how people respond to the trends, the actual technology itself, and how they'll adopt these exciting technologies in the future. Because, as you say, there's a lot of talk about the economical advantage, a lot of talk about the sort of advance in the technology. I think it's really important to concentrate on the impact that these things can have on people.
Thank you, Andrew. And Tannya, finally, to you.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew, thanks, Scott, for having us. And Andrew, Mariam, I loved hearing that introduction, specifically because they touched upon something that I hold really dear to my heart. I am a technology evangelist. I do write, speak, evangelize a lot about the impact of AI on society. But importantly, I'm also the head of partnerships at All Academy. And All Academy is a future-focused educational organization that is disrupting traditional high school curricula to ensure that future generations are equipped with the right tools, skills, values, and mindsets to be able to thrive in this post-AI, post-automation world, right? So hearing other industry leaders and speakers talk about how they're more invested in what this means for us to be human, or what it means to be human in a post-automation world is really refreshing for me, because I feel like it's something that I'm starting to dedicate my life towards doing, right? What fascinates me about AI is the fact that it has a dramatic impact on our consciousness, on society as a whole, and on the fundamental meaning of being human. And it causes us to question that, which is absolutely fascinating. So I'm really excited for the conversation we're about to have.
Andrew, I'm going to come back to you because you were just there saying about AI helping people and in the business of helping people. How grateful should we be to AI right now? Because obviously we've got coronavirus abroad in the world. How much has AI helped us in tackling this pandemic?
I think we should be very grateful. There are numerous ways in which AI has helped governments, supply chains, and ultimately people to get through the pandemic. I mean, I think that the smart governments out there have been absolutely on top of the way in which they have organized data, the way in which they have governed data, the way in which they have exchanged data between different agencies so that you can actually make the AI work. Because let's be honest, without that data availability, then there won't be any AI. Where governments have made that happen, you see AI being used to make sure that scarce resources are being used most effectively. So in the white heat of the pandemic, having an ability to understand where the pandemic is going to surge next, how you can place valuable equipment like respirators, like the right kind of drugs, like making sure that the right kind of beds there is really, really important. So that's the first thing, resources. The second thing is just understanding the pandemic and how it's going to develop. And again, there have been some sophisticated approaches on the part of governments here in the UAE and out in the rest of the world that are modelling, say, where the pandemic is going to develop next, in which segments of the population. And we're now starting to see those models develop further. Obviously, the vaccinations are coming to the forefront of the battle against the pandemic, and understanding the impacts that the different sorts of vaccines are having on the different parts of the population is again super important and is driven by AI. And the last thing that I'd like to say on this really is what we do with AI going forward with regards to the pandemic. And we're sort of not talking about ride sharing, for example, anymore, and in a mobility context, but how we use AI to navigate our way around public spaces, how we use AI to sort of make sure that events happen in a way that is safe and in which we can exercise proper social distancing, I think represent useful uses for AI in the future.
It's interesting you talk about events, and Mariam, I'll bring you in here. I mean, I was presenting a webinar with the Dubai Future, the Museum of the Future in the background. And that was all about the future of events and how Dubai had been able to reopen events already and was leading the way. So again, Andrew talking about smart governance. Give us your perspective from the Dubai, from the Dubai perspective on this, and how Dubai has used AI to tackle the pandemic.
I mean, I think Andrew named a lot of important points, like using data, kind of predictive processes to figure out, where the pandemic may move within the city. But one of the more practical ways I think that we saw AI being used was in, for example, radars. When there was a lockdown, we saw the police using AI to ensure that people weren't breaching that, to ensure that we were kept safe. We also see it in malls. So, for example, Dubai Mall, someplace that I think a lot of people, go quite frequently, and the cameras that are there also utilize AI to ensure people's temperatures are the right temperatures, and again, not breaching any of the COVID regulations or policies in place. Another interesting case, and I'm not sure if it was used as much here, but we saw in a number of other countries the use of kind of robot nurses to care for people when actual people weren't able to be in those spaces with patients. And I think healthcare in general can really benefit and is benefiting from AI in terms of diagnostics, in terms of better reading of diseases and the like. So I think particularly for opportunities for AI, healthcare is a huge sector.
Tannya, AI is perhaps, and data and the use of data has perhaps had a bit of a bad press at times. Do you think the pandemic's actually woken people up to the potential benefits of it being used?
Of AI, yeah, absolutely. I think what's interesting to me about all of this is the fact that it's been a great sort of warning signal for us, right? The world wasn't prepared for this, and it's been such an amazing indicator of what we need to do to prepare for the future and how prepared we need to be and how we need to tap into and leverage these technologies for our benefit. And I think for a lot of the Luddites of the world, using tools like AI for contact tracing or for location tagging and things like that actually allow us to make better decisions in the future. In the past, it may appear to be something that, like you say, has received a lot of bad press and is asked for us to be cautious about it. But in my view, if anything, this points to the fact that we need to tap into the power of these, what we call exponential technologies, to drive the future and to make better decisions now as well as in the future. So, while a lot of us are sitting at home, the amazing thing is that a team of scientists are using AI to also predict where the next novel coronavirus could emerge. And researchers are using a combination of fundamental biology, of machine learning, to predict many more potential hosts of the new virus strains that have been previously detected. And that's really fascinating to me, right? I always say technology itself is a double-edged sword. The fire that kept us warm also burnt our houses down. So how we leverage it is entirely up to us. But if there's one thing that this pandemic has taught us, is that it's really brought us together and it's allowed our economies to survive despite everything. So that's really fascinating to me.
The one word there that I identified with was Luddite, which is a bit of a shame for me. Andrew, you were about to say something there? Were you going to come in then?
Yeah, I wanted to pick up on Tanya's double-edged sword point, really. And I've observed a couple of instances where AI has left government with a couple of red faces, and this is the pandemic accelerating the government towards AI, where it might otherwise have stuck with more traditional approaches to doing core activities. So a little personal anecdote: my kid, who's in the UK, was one of the children who received his examination results via algorithm this year, which caused quite a few red faces in government and quite a bit of backtracking as well. And you had actually professionals examining the code in the open, and professional data scientists, whilst also having the politicians trying to explain the way in which the exam results had been delivered, because obviously there was seen to be amongst the public an unfair distribution of those grades, with the usual parts of society seem to come off worse. And the other example I'll give quickly was the government of the Netherlands, which actually the cabinet had to resign because of their controversial use of an algorithm in delivering benefits to its citizens. So this is the job of government, really. It has to be there to experiment and to lead and to create markets, but that also brings with it some risk with regard to its own activities.
We perhaps shouldn't bring in the UK's track and trace program at this point. That would seem almost too unfair. It's clear, obviously, that AI is not going anywhere. It's not a genie that can be put back in the box. In fact, this is going to be a massive part of all of our futures. I'm looking at data research here, which is saying a PwC report recently predicted that within the Middle East, by 2030, AI will be worth $320 billion as an industry. And it's expected to make up 13.6% of the UAE's GDP, followed by Saudi Arabia at 12.5%. If it's going to be this massive, ever-present part of our life moving forward, ever hence, what are the challenges and opportunity that AI poses to governments, to businesses, and to society as a whole? And I'm going to come to you, Mariam, first. It's a massive question, but where do we begin to even discuss that?
Sure. I think with the opportunities, we've kind of listed them. We can see them in education. For example, there's some work that we're doing at the foundation now around using AI-powered toys to support children with learning disabilities. So we've seen that AI can actually really help children with autism because it kind of learns based on patterns that this child is going through, and then helps kind of tailor its learning or its teaching to that child. So we've seen that it can be very, very helpful, and when it's being used in learning and it is able to be very kind of specific to the task at hand. I think in terms of the challenges, and maybe I'll touch on that case as well, and Andrew mentioned, and I think Tannya as well, data and the ethics around it are kind of for me, I think the big thing that we have to focus on, particularly when we think about governance. So again, in this case of the toys, one of the things that we're looking at is really the privacy. So if you're a child and you're, enjoying your time with your stuffed toy, you're probably not thinking about all the data that you're also giving this toy and then the manufacturer of that toy. And there aren't really legislation, I think, or there aren't a lot of policies, let's say, that are around and this as much as there should be. I think also algorithm auditing is going to become a key because we need to think about bias. I mean, we think about the use of AI in helping, let's say, automate processes like HR and the likes, especially when reviewing applications. So huge amounts of data, AI can get through that much faster than we can. But then it opens up questions of bias. There is a number of cases that have come up where the AI, based on the data being input, then ended up, favoring a certain group or discriminating against another solely based on data. So I think these kind of things are challenges, but then we also see the opportunities of them. And I guess we go back to this double-edged sword.
I'm not sure I want a job interview done by AI. I might be able to convince a human being that I'm half decent at this job, but a computer would see straight through me. Andrew, Mariam's talking about ethics. This is obviously a perfect place to bring you in ethics. Talk to us about how you see ethics, because obviously there's a lot out there right now. We look at the algorithms powering Facebook and social media. Lots of concerns about the ethics of AI and algorithms. How vital is it to get it right in this space? And as Mariam was there talking as well about regulation, is there enough regulation in this space to keep us safe?
Well, I mean, I think there's a problem with regulation per se. It's often seen as a dirty word, especially by industry. Nobody wants too much regulation, and you alluded to the big tech companies, and obviously there's a constant tug of war going on between those and government with regards to how closely they're regulated. But what we're doing at Smart Dubai really is, I think, a great example of anticipatory regulation. I think everybody knows that something has to happen with regards to regulation of artificial intelligence and emerging technology. So we in government have to understand that we can't do this on our own. We don't have the monopoly on the knowledge of the technologies, far from it. Indeed, that makes the discussion that we need to hold with industry, with legal experts, with consumers and citizens, all the more important, because this, in the end, is all about adoption. Adoption will be good because it will create economic opportunity and it will create better services and better lives for people. And that is government's job. So we have set out at Smart Dubai with the help of an AI ethics board that is populated by the sorts of professions that I described a couple of minutes ago, to seek to understand how we make AI safe and fair and ethical. So there are plenty of examples out there of principles and of guidelines. What I think we've done differently at Dubai is to create an ethical AI self-assessment toolkit. So this is just a way of exposing with developers, with commissioners of AI, either in government or outside of government, providing AI or building AI for governments, with a checklist that addresses some of those issues that Mariam was talking about. So how explainable is your AI? How free of bias is your AI or the data on which your AI is being trained? How diverse is your AI team? How closely does it reflect society? So there are plenty of other tools that probably come further down the line that are more diagnostic. But we think this is a really great start in terms of having a board that just holds the conversation and a developing conversation around the regulation of AI, which will come in time, and then to try to create this feedback loop with the market, with the users of AI, through the creation of the ethical AI toolkit. So regulation, not to everybody's tastes, but it's government's job to do it and to make sure that it's done well, so that people's data is treated appropriately and is kept private, and so that we leverage the huge potential out of the technology itself.
I'm just going to quickly invite the listening audience as well. If you want to pose a question to our panel, please write in the comment box. And if we've got time, we'll definitely pose that to our panelists. Tannya, one last question here on ethics before we move on to another question. Do we have an opportunity here, actually, with AI to actually do better? Human beings, we've got kind of like a mixed track record when it comes to ethics. Have we got the ability to actually teach it to be better than ourselves?
Absolutely. I think an amazing use case or example in which we can see that AI can do better, and why we should employ AI to make decisions in ways that may actually suit us is it's the amazing thing that DeepMind did a few years ago with AlphaGo. So AlphaGo was an AI that was created to mimic to be able to play the game Go, which is very, very deeply rooted in Chinese culture. Over 3,000 years ago, it's a big part of it. It's also a game that requires a lot of strategic and original thinking, right? And for many years, computer programmers would create AI that can play Go, but that would still not really be able to hit that mark, right? The AI would be able to play Go at the same level as an amateur human player. But then then DeepMind decided to invest into this technology and really see the extent to how deep neural networks can connect and sort of create connections between themselves to be able to learn from their own mistakes and then become better Go players. And today, we've got AlphaGo that's able to beat the world's world champion in Go, in the world champion human player, right? And to me, this is a really, there's an excellent documentary for the audience members. I would highly recommend it. It's available on YouTube about this whole process. And to me, what that tells me is that, the power of these technologies, of AI, to be able to parse such large amounts of data, and bear in mind that we produce something like 2.5 quintillion bytes of data every single day, right? Through all the devices that we interact with and so on. So the fact that we've got this power machine, right? Machine learning based artificial neural networks that are able to parse enormous amounts of data tells us that they might actually be able to make decisions in ways that human players cannot. And AlphaGo it's a huge testament to that fact that that's true. And I think it's just, there's so much opportunity there to employ the sort of decision making, the sort of original thinking that a human player might be blind to because of the ability of these algorithms to be able to parse such large amounts of data. There's a huge opportunity to employ it in HR, in the enterprise, whether it's for economic purposes like driving revenue, or even something more humanistic, right? Like employing it in healthcare, as Miriam mentioned. So yeah, for me, I'm really excited about it.
Learning from our mistakes. What an interesting notion. I'm not sure it's going to catch on. I was recently talking to Blair Shepherd, who is the global head of strategy for PwC, and he's written a book called 10 Years to Midnight, which is amazing, if terrifying. And one of the things he talks about is the unintended consequence of technology. And one of those unintended consequences is the loss of millions of jobs to AI. So Mariam, I want to come to you first. Dubai Future Foundation. How do we ensure that the region and the world is able to rebalance the job situation? Because clearly there are going to be jobs that are going to be going over the next few years to AI.
Sure. I actually like this question because I like to negate it. So jobs will be lost. Absolutely, not to say otherwise. And this is a bit of an old report, but I like to bring up these numbers because the World Economic Forum actually estimated that AI could displace about 75 million jobs globally. So not just in the region, globally by 2022, which is, as we know, next year. And it's a massive, massive number. But they also estimated that it would actually that artificial intelligence would lead to 133 million new jobs. Again, I'm not saying that these numbers are exact, but I think that what this shows is that there's actually a lot more opportunity, and there's actually a development of new jobs that will come from this. So for example, we're mentioning bias, or I mentioned algorithm auditing. You'll have a number of people who will be moving maybe from their more IT-focused jobs to be kind of monitoring the AI that's in place and looking at things that only people can really look at, right? Which is this idea of consciousness, this idea of kind of reason and instinct, which, I don't think, we can debate, but I don't think a machine will ever really learn. So new jobs are going to be created from that. But I think it's as well, one thing that is really important to focus on is that it's not also just about making new jobs. It's also about upskilling. So I think we really need to take the people that are in the jobs that may be lost because of operational efficiency, because automation can lead to better operational efficiency, and put them in other roles because they have the skill set, they have the drive to do other things. So it's not that your job can now be automated, you no longer matter. It's the skills that you have can help us in many other ways, can support us in many other ways. So upskilling, I think, is huge, and will be kind of a huge part of the way that we approach HR and talent development.
Andrew, I mean, Dubai started embracing smart years before it was actually fashionable to start talking about smart cities, I think. What's your take on the work that's being done here to kind of protect society, jobs, employment as we move forward and as AI becomes an ever increasing part of the mix?
Yeah, well, I'm upset. Mariam stole my statistic. I got exactly the same set from World Economic Forum. So I'll not repeat what Mariam said. I think here in Dubai, there is a tremendous amount of work being done in the academic institutions to train the workforce of tomorrow, because this, I think, is one of the biggest challenges facing the upstream part of labour market economics. It's that you need a well-trained workforce that can slip into the jobs of the future, and the jobs of the future are not so clearly defined as they were when I entered the labour market, or even before that. So it requires both a really high specificity around the technology and the computer science and the data engineering, but then there's also the other side of this that Mariam referred to as well, which is the place for human judgment and creative thinking that is also going to be really important for the people who fill the jobs of the future. And I think academic institutions are starting to really turn their minds to that in an effective way. I think as well, there's obviously the switchers. There's the people who started a career doing job A and probably end up doing job Z. And to make sure, I think, that we are providing in-work training and as in the workplace itself, but also allowing opportunities for people to sort of move around the labour market in a bit more of a flexible fashion. I think that's going to be really important as well. The Dubai government has obviously been sort of seeking to attract and retain talent through things like the Golden Visa. I think that has to carry on. It has to be part of a much wider sweep of policy interventions to be all government for a moment about how you create a thriving digital economy within the Emirate of Dubai and indeed the wider UAE.
Tannya, both Andrew and Mariam there talking about the kind of the emotional decisions, those things that AI can't yet do, and that remains a kind of skill area, shall we say, or an area of strength for these poor human beings. Can you ever see the day? I mean, I've seen technologies talking about emotional intelligence as well as AI. Can you see AI being able to develop that aspect, that empathy, where even that becomes challenged by AI?
That's a great question, and I'm going to give you an example of a experiment that's being done currently somewhere in California. A group of scientists have put together, I read about this in Stealing Fire by Stephen Kotler, a great book. They put together a virtual assistant, AI-powered virtual assistant, a virtual therapist, known as Elle. And the amazing thing is that what Elle is able to do, this AI-powered virtual therapist, is she's able to interact. I say she, but obviously we're talking about a robot. But let's roll with it. She's able to interact with patients who've suffered from PTSD, patients who are suffering from a variety of other mental illnesses or who have been through something traumatic, and she's able to pick up on nonverbal cues that a human actor may or may not pick up upon. Right. So to me, if we're asking whether or not AI will actually, become the sort of emotionally intelligent AI that we see in science fiction movies like her, it's really difficult to say if we'll ever make that leap. That leap would be the leap that we make from what we call narrow AI, which is the sort of AI that we're surrounded by today, to general AI, which would be human level general intelligence AI. But now that's a separate question. It's really difficult to say if and when we'll make that leap. Honestly, nobody could tell you that answer. But if we're talking about AI being employed for empathetic activities like this, being a therapist, I think there's a lot of potential there, because there's a lot of potential, to use AI to help us, assist us with our decision making by being able to pick up on cues that human actors would not be able to pick up upon. So yeah, I definitely see a lot of potential use cases in that space. But again, are we going to see emotionally intelligent AI that have their own goals and their own aspirations and that go out and try to break free? It's really difficult to say, and we really don't have enough of a prediction model to be able to say when and if we'll ever get to that point.
Mariam, just to build on something what Tannya was saying there as well about the sort of the therapeutic aspects. We had a story in Arabian Business not so long ago, and this kind of all stems out of the pandemic, where mental health is something that's really come to the fore during the pandemic. And there was a survey that said actually the majority of people would rather talk about their mental health to a robot than to a human being, which was perhaps a surprising statistic. But is that a massive area of opportunity, that actually having therapists that people don't feel uncomfortable talking to because they're not talking to human beings, so therefore they don't feel they're being judged?
It's interesting because there are a number of those apps as well, like chatbots that you can engage with. And I'm drawing a blank on the names, but I do think sometimes it is easier to tell what seems like a non-human being your issues and your needs, because unfortunately I think mental health is still somewhat of a stigma kind of across the world. So perhaps the kind of the AI is less judgmental, or your own worry or your own perception is of that AI is less. You feel less judged, let's say. But I think, as I mentioned before, generally, healthcare is a huge sector that AI can benefit, or we can see the opportunities. And so that's from diagnostics all the way to, in this case, therapists, all the way to what I was talking about earlier with the smart toys, childhood development and the like. So I think for me, if I could pick one sector to focus on with AI, it would be healthcare.
Andrew, you're a father, I'm a father. What's AI going to mean for our children, and how are their lives going to be different to our lives right now?
Oh gosh, that might be the how long is a piece of string question, Scott. Clearly AI is going to be more in their lives than it has been in ours. I think I'll go back to one of the points I made in my opening comments, which is about acceptability or uptake or adoption. My children readily give their data, and they expect in return for giving their data certain services, certain pieces of entertainment, certain pieces of education material that that I never had access to, and they don't mind. So for me, I think they will sort of hopefully have the human experience that I have. I don't quite know that I'm there on the therapy point that we were just talking about, the sort of prospect of a Hippocratic oath meeting ethical AI, I think might still be a little way distant. But in terms of the sort of services and the experiences that they have, I think their reality will be augmented through AI in a way that is much like real life today. So I think to me it's more about the deal that happens underneath with the data, and them being sort of more comfortable with that than certain sections of society are today. I'll go back to my point about the job market. Actually, that I suppose is the biggest worry for me. It's the things that my eldest child is learning in his A levels, and that my youngest child is learning in his GCSEs, and hopefully they'll learn into university. I hope they apply in the job market that exists. I can't help thinking that the notion of a job for life is well and truly gone. That the jobs that they will have might be done on more of a sort of an ad hoc basis, in which there are sort of special contracting arrangements about the way in which they will sort of interact with technologies. So the labour market I see as being a bit more uncertain. In terms of the experiential side of life, I see it as being enhanced, but hopefully, still with plenty of human in the loop, so that they themselves lead happy lives.
I mean, Tannya, you're a self-proclaimed evangelist and a futurist. I mean, Andrew, there with genuine concerns about the labour market. As the evangelist, what do you say to the person that loses their job from AI? Because they're not going to look at this and go, "Oh yeah, that's great."
It's a very real concern, and it's not something that we should ignore. And this is why I always say it's important to think, about this whole issue in the short term as well as the long term. And it's also why I'm so passionate about educational reform, because at the educational level, at the high school level, we need to be teaching young minds skills. We need to be teaching things in a multidisciplinary way. It's no longer enough for us to have that industrial era model of, students learning math, science, physics, whatever, and writing an exam and memorizing. We're way past that, right? Especially in this technology era. So that's one thing. But I would say equally, an important statistic that always kind of shocks me is from Gallup, right? So Gallup runs polls across the United States and worldwide, and Gallup polls tell us that employee disengagement, so employees who are not engaged with work, is at an all-time high. And I think it's something like 87% of workers in America are disengaged at work. And we have to ask ourselves, what is the dollar value attached to that in terms of productivity, but also what does that mean for the sort of lives that people are living, right? We spend an enormous amount of time at work. So if we're feeling disengaged and if we're feeling like our intrinsic motivations are not being met at the workplace, then that's a real problem and a real waste of human creativity, innovation, and potential. And it's something we need to target and do something about. So for me, the possibility of not being stuck in one career in the future, or of having the opportunity to sort of explore, do things in a multidisciplinary way, because automation has liberated us from doing all of that mundane, tedious work that we need to be done to keep our societies flourishing. That's a huge opportunity for us to be able to sort of reflect and ask ourselves, how do we reach our creative potential, right? So if we're thinking Maslow's hierarchy of needs, now I think more and more people have the opportunity to go up that hierarchy, up that pyramid, and achieve self-actualization. And so I say, Andrew, you have a lot of reasons to be excited about your children's future. And that's how I feel, especially if they're, on that path and be equipping themselves with the right mindsets and tools to be able to keep a job, even in that accelerating era of accelerating change.
Well, I'm older than Andrew, but both Andrew and I talk about a job for life. Mariam, are you expecting to have a job for life, or are you expecting AI to empower multiple careers or career changes for you? And also, what's happening at the education level? Because again, Tannya, they're talking about education. Is education changing fast enough to embrace this and put in, the skills and the qualifications needed for my daughter and Andrew's children to get those jobs and to switch careers and to be future fit?
Well, on the first question, I mean, I hope I have a job for life. And whatever it is, I do agree that jobs are probably going to change. So it's not to say that we're going to be in the same job, for the next 20 years. But I do hope I have a job for life. In terms of AI, though, I think, we talk a lot about kind of machine-human integration, and I think that's how the future is going to go. We're not going to be replaced by AI, but a lot more of the work that we do is going to integrate AI in some shape or form, either in terms of, data sets and using that for our own operational efficiency, or just in the way that we interact with people. I mean, I don't know if you heard that given the distance learning, you mentioned education, facial recognition was being used, to ensure students weren't cheating. So there's already this kind of integration of AI, whatever kind of ethical questions that raises.
I'm really glad I didn't go to school right now.
But I think in terms of the education system itself, I think we are thinking about it as a country. I mean, you see and that's with the Mohammed bin Zayed University for AI. So there's already an educational institute that's focused primarily on that. But even before that, a lot of the big universities already taught some form of AI, whether it be courses kind of around it, or, in terms of how you program and work with it. Even within schools, I have two nephews, and I think within a few years, they're both going to be much more aware of what AI is and kind of able to deal with that a lot faster than I will be, even with the job that I have today. So there's definitely, this integration already happening. I think the thing that we can focus more on, and maybe this is where I'll turn to Andrew, is the ethical components of it. And that's where it would be interesting even to have kind of courses around that to help us think about that more.
Turning to Andrew. Andrew, this is the question you feared. It's not quite the question you feared. What's the biggest misconception about AI? Or what's the question that I'm not asking you that I should be asking you about
AI? Okay, well, let me try and take a lead from what Mariam was saying. And I think it's probably how free from bias or how fair or how explainable can AI ever be? AI is a massively broad church that is, still to be properly understood. So we've been talking about narrow AI over the course of this discussion. We've also been discussing neural networks, and the further you get towards neural networks, then the more black box the operation becomes. And I think there's still a lot. It's a really developing field. I mentioned the prospect for more diagnostic tools that sit on top of like the building block self-assessment toolkit I mentioned. So the sorts of tools that at the moment are they're methods, but they're not commercial products, or they're not products that you can take to market. I don't really mean commercial. I mean they're not really there available for widespread use yet. Tools that will help us address bias detection, tools that will help us ensure fairness within algorithms, tools that will help us to explain algorithms and AI systems more effectively. And this explainability also applies to like the workforce as well as to the population at large, because your workforce, your agents, they could be frontline workers who need to explain a decision about the distribution of a benefit or a service. They could be workers who are standing next to a piece of heavy plant, and they want to be sure that they want to have it explained to them how that piece of heavy plant will in fact operate, and it will do so in a safe way that won't harm them. So this point to me about the further tooling that will make AI as explainable, as fair, and as free from bias as possible, I think is really, really important.
I'll stay with you for a second, Andrew. Sorry, Tannya. Sorry, Mario. You mentioned the word commercial there. And if I cast my mind back to when Facebook first came out and we were looking at Facebook and social media as this amazing algorithm that connected us all. And we now look at it and we look at it going, it's a commercial algorithm that's trying to addict us. How do you ensure that you stop commercialization overriding the noble intentions and the ethics?
Well, I think that's where regulation comes in. And I think government's job is to get its own house in order first. Then it has the license, the moral authority to start to really hold a mature discussion around regulation with some of the organizations that you've mentioned. Then it's then you have license to go and operate with the private sector, I think.
Tannya, I'm a Luddite. What should I be most scared about? What should I be most excited about? AI.
I think, what should you be most scared about? Let's start with that because that's an interesting one. I would say be afraid of the fact that this is an exponential technology. Now, this is both an opportunity and a threat. And what it means for a technology to be on the exponential trajectory is that as opposed to thinking linearly that, once you start at point A, if you go 30 steps forward, you'll be at point B. that logic no longer applies to development of technologies like AI. Instead, we need to think exponentially, and exponential thinking is not linear to us, right? So it requires a doubling of numbers. So if you go from 2, you go to 4, 8, 16, and so on. And an interesting analogy to think of it in is this, which is that if we were to take 30 linear steps, you would just be 30 feet ahead of point A. But if you were to take 30 exponential steps, you'd be able to circumnavigate the globe 26 times. And that's really remarkable, right? But that's the sort of trajectory that this technology is on, along with other exponential technologies. And these are shaping the fourth industrial revolution. So I would say be afraid in the sense that try to fight your intuitions, which will tell you to think about this linearly, and instead try to think about it exponentially. And that'll tell you where we'll be 5, 10, 20, 30 years from now. And I think that sort of thinking is really important in the government sector, at the industry level, and also at the individual level, if we want to try to evaluate what the impact is going to be, X years from now. So that's something to keep in mind. And what to be excited about is also kind of the same point, which is that means that there's a crazy amount of opportunity out there for us when it comes to artificial intelligence and what it means to transcend at the human level. Ray Kurzweil, former director of engineering at Google, wrote this remarkable book called The Singularity is Near, where he talks about how we may or may not approach technological singularity. And if we reach that point where we're able to saturate the entire universe with our intelligence, what that means is that we can go and explore, the opportunity to extend life across the universe, explore what it's like to live in Mars, things that'll really help us navigate the rest of space, which is amazing. And I think that we can really employ robotics and AI to do that. And that's really exciting to me because it'll cause us to question things at the individual level, but also societally, we're explorers. That's what human beings are. And that's what we ought to be doing.
I'm waiting for Mars book to come out then, the new social media for Mars. Mariam, again, Tannya there talking about the fourth industrial revolution. I remember watching the movie and reading about Alan Turing and when computers used to be the massive machines that it is. And she's talking about exponential growth in this sector. Where in the tell us where the fourth industrial revolution goes and what's the revolution that comes after that?
Frankly, we haven't even, I think, hit mid the fourth industrial revolution, and maybe I shouldn't say that, but I think we're still, thinking about all of the ways to develop that further. So develop this technology further, very similar to what Tannya said. She said we're talking about narrow AI, and then there's a shift into general AI. So I think we're really at the beginning of 4AR, if I can say. Mm-hmm. And what's next? What's the fifth industrial revolution? I hope we don't call it that. So I think.
Well, let me stop you there for a second, because there will be people dialing in wouldn't necessarily know. How do we define what is the fourth industrial revolution?
Sure. Generally, we define it as what we call emerging technology. So things like blockchain, Internet of Things, drones, the large kind of big data, AI. So basically, the things that, or the systems that we're utilizing to, make our lives hopefully better.
Okay, great. Question for you, Andrew. Back when we were kids, we were looking at, when I was a geek, so I was watching Star Trek. But a lot of the technology that was dreamed up by those science fiction writers ended up becoming true. What are we seeing now that, in 10, 15, 20, 30 years, which seems fantasy now, you think was genuinely going to be a reality?
Sorry, Scott, you're saying what will we see in 30 years' time? What are we seeing now that we think is a fantasy, but that in 10, 15 or 20 years' time will be reality? Oh, okay. Wow, that is a really tricky one. I think the thing to be wary of.
I want to invest in.
Yeah. Okay. I think the thing to be wary of is, I think as Tannya was mentioning, the sort of artificial general intelligence. That seems to be the item on the technology bucket list around which there is sort of most hype but least certainty about it becoming a reality. But on what we will, I honestly don't know. I mean, I could try to string a load of buzzwords together, Scott, but about I don't know, sort of bio, nanotechnologies, things like that, nanomedicines. I mean, I think a lot of these things are starting to emerge and be there now. But I just think it's that point that technology, artificial intelligence will be right the way across our lives, jobs, play, home lives. The way in which we manage our energy systems, all of those things and more probably. But to point to a specific thing now that appears to be a figment of our imagination, I'm finding a little bit tricky, I'm afraid.
I demand answers, Andrew. I demand answers. Tannya, any buzzwords for us? Any thoughts? Any predictions?
Futurist.
Exactly.
Honestly, I think science fiction is amazing. Good science fiction is a great predictor of future technology, and that's why Star Trek is so much better than Star Wars. But I would say
that's an entirely different webinar.
Yeah, now we'll get the audience like weeping in. You know what? I'm gonna keep it simple. We'll be able to colonize Mars, and the UAE is already doing phenomenal things on that front. So are a bunch of other countries, and that's a really exciting space. We can test, we can validate, we can send stuff to space, and that's without having to harm human lives. And that's really remarkable, right? So our systems are getting better. So I would say let's expect to hear more about colonizing space in the future.
Okay. Mariam, I'm gonna not to put you in an uncomfortable position, but so with the Dubai Future Foundation, how do you think AI is going to make our lives different, better, be able to explore our own humanity more in the way that Tannya is talking about?
Well, one of the things that we've been thinking about lately is this concept of like the digital twin or an avatar. So I think for us, it raises a number of interesting things, right? You can live in a completely virtual world and kind of exist without really existing. And I think that's quite an interesting thing that we might see more of and might be, especially kind of in the pandemic, would have been great to be able to travel and kind of live like that vicariously through an avatar that is you. But I think it also raises questions, and it goes back to what I said right at the beginning around like, what does it mean to be human, and what are the ethical questions around that? How far do we go? How far is too far? And I think that's going to become a larger discussion. How much do we really want to create, and then when do we kind of stop? And is there a stop?
Yeah, Andrew, is there a stop?
I think Mariam makes an important point, actually. And again, without and again, not to bring us down as we head towards the end of this really interesting time together, but there might come a point at which society says, enough. There are enough jobs, enough loss of income, and yes, there are solutions like a universal basic income, which are sort of being discussed in some political circles. But there might come a point where there's so much social and political pressure that we actually pull back from some of the applications of AI that we could put out there for the greater good of humanity and for the peace within society. I mean, there are various sort of theories about climate change and how that can affect stability between countries. There's obviously the effect of the pandemic as it worked itself through. Maybe humans are starting to change their mind a little bit about the way in which they want to live and the way in which they do want to sort of coexist with technology.
So are you saying that human beings are actually going to limit the growth of artificial intelligence? If that's the case, isn't artificial intelligence going to send back killer robots to enslave us all?
I don't think we're going to see that. I think we'll put enough regulation in place to make sure it never happens. And that's the man from the government saying that.
Last question to each of you. And thank you for your time. You've been really, really generous putting up with my inane questions, just like my wife. Tannya, this year or over the next 5 years, what's the biggest thing that's exciting you about AI?
Absolutely, the employment of AI in two sectors. One is the law, as well as in healthcare. And the pandemic will undoubtedly, I think Mariam alluded to this earlier, the pandemic will undoubtedly help us see and facilitate and empower the use of AI in these different, in the healthcare sector. And I think what's really interesting is that a lot of innovators, right, a lot of startups, a lot of VCs will be investing into startups and innovators who are developing these landmark technologies. That's really exciting. And the other spaces, of course, I'm really excited to see the sort of ethical and legal frameworks that we do build around how to use AI. I think this is marks a fundamental shift. We've always thought in the past of technology being for technologists and law being for lawyers and psychology being for psychologists. But today we need people to come together and think in a multidisciplinary way, who form these ethical boards, who are able to tap into their mindsets or the learnings from multiple different disciplines and come together and actually create solutions that'll help us thrive in the future. So I'm really excited to see how different governments will take that forward. And I think the UAE is doing a remarkable job if everything that Andrew is saying in sort of ensuring that we build those frameworks.
Mariam, I guess you concur with what Tannya just said there. What's exciting you, on your to-do list this year at the Dubai Future Foundation? What's exciting you the most?
For me, it's local production, so R&D basically. I'm very excited about this kind of shift towards doing a lot of this production in-house with companies here in the UAE, bringing them here to work on the development of these systems and AI itself. I think one of the things that I really hope kind of in the next few years that we see is, there's a lot of reliance or a lot of kind of import of, let's say, Western AI, and you wouldn't think of importing a particular system that works in one country into another country, right? Because it doesn't really make sense. You're not going to take something that works as a road system and put it here in the UAE. So I think for us, we've generally imported a lot of Western AI. So I'm looking forward to, if I can say, kind of the rise of Middle Eastern AI.
Yeah. Great. And then finally to you, Andrew, the most important question you have to answer. Is Tannya right? Is Star Trek better than Star Wars? Smart Dubai 2021. What are you really looking forward to this year? What's the biggest thing on your to-do list?
Okay, well, I tell you what, so I'm going to sort of in part tell you what I am sort of watching with interest as well. So I think the democratization of machine learning techniques based around the wider availability of data is super, super interesting. So if you think about the sort of Reddit GameStop community and what the disruptive effect that had on traditional financial markets, really, really interesting. And there are other examples of that. There's something called they call themselves the data police, which again is like a sort of homegrown community of data activists who are sort of mining and scraping crime data in the States to bring a greater sense of accountability to that particular field. But what are we really sort of starting to get fired up by at Smart Dubai? I think it's as Mariam said, it's that homegrown production of artificial intelligence, and that really is about trying to create a thriving ecosystem and opportunities for local businesses to thrive in AI. And obviously a central piece of that, you'd expect me to say it is all the work that we're doing around safe and fair and ethical AI, but it's how you start to piece together the data and how we treat data privacy in the UAE, the data infrastructure that we build so that people put their data centers here, the sorts of partnerships that you need to make work between, big commercial motherships and then much smaller businesses in which there's a sort of high innovation potential in academia we've mentioned, and then the labor force as well. So making all of those sort of cogs turn together to deliver economic and social value in the region, I think is super, super exciting and important, especially in this particular moment as we start to move through the pandemic.
Excellent way to finish the webinar. Thank you so much for your time. Genuinely fascinating. I could talk to you for hours. I'm sure there's a big debate raging now on Star Trek versus Star Wars. Mariam, sorry?
Star Trek.
Star Trek. There we get 2 votes for. Mariam, casting vote?
Star Wars.
Oh. And I'm on the fence, so I guess Star Trek takes it. No, thank you to Andrew, to Tannya, to Mariam, and thank you to everybody that's tuned into the Restart webinar and podcast, again, in association with Arabian Business and the Prestige Group. Thank you so much, you guys. Thank you all for your insight and wisdom. It's been really interesting talking to us today. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Thank you.